The Jerusalem delegation. The advanced scouting team, if you will. These guys traveled 90 miles to come and hear Jesus. They'd heard a lot of things in Jerusalem around the temple, a lot of word on the street, secondhand, people sharing stories, some gossip. And make no mistake, these guys, these scribes and Pharisees, these strict followers of tradition and law, were keeping a close eye and a dutiful ear on the things that Jesus was teaching and saying, and also keeping an eagle eye on his disciples. And let me tell you, the reports that they were going to take back to Jerusalem, to the rest, probably were a little bit of a mixed bag, and if not leaning about this itinerant pastor from Galilee, this so-called rabbi, this teacher, likes to sometimes color outside the lines of what's acceptable. Now, at first blush, this text is about some disciples washing with dirty hands, or not washing their dirty hands. And I mean, if you've had kids, or you watch them play outside, maybe they're out in the mud or playing around, playing with the ball, maybe picking their nose, whatever. They come in and sit down at the table, and you're like, guys, I mean, some of you probably done this. Maybe you've been the recipient of it as a child. Go wash your hands. All right, go wash your hands. And the Pharisees and scribes say to Jesus, how come your disciples don't wash their hands? And then Mark, the gospel writer, goes into this big exposition about how all the Jews, all the people of the Judaic faith wash their hands. Well, clearly that's an exaggeration because all of Jesus' disciples, the men and women who follow him, are Jewish. They didn't wash their hands. That's the rule according to the tradition of the elders. And then Mark goes on and on to say, and when they go through the marketplace, they don't touch anything without washing their hands either, which is a strange kind of thing, right? I mean, who cares if they're shopping and they wash their hands or not? And then it goes on to say they wash their pots and their kettles and their pans and their beds. I mean, these guys are some rigorous cleaners. I know I had a couple of people in my family that when we would go and visit, the furniture's all in plastic. Basically, when I went to visit, I knew this is a no-kids zone. This is no fun of any kind, right? But in all realism, I mean, if I'm sitting down with Peter after his stinky fish cleaning, and I want him to pass the bread rolls to me, I don't want to taste, some fishy taste. Wash your hands, kid. No, but the text really is less about the washing of hands and more about what the Pharisees and scribes feel about obedience to God and what Jesus as a teacher is allowing. Is he following the rules? Is he teaching others to do the same? Or is he leading kind of a lackadaisical version of Judaism that pretty much anything goes, and he's allowing that and teaching that, and that's just not okay? But it's even a little bit deeper than that and of following the rules, because before we again pile on the scribes and Pharisees, I want us to understand where they're coming from a little bit, because the Pharisees were a specific political and religious sect that believed very firmly that all the things that were going wrong in Israel, that the state of their nation, the occupation by Rome, all these things were because, at the root of the matter, that the people had drifted. They had assimilated to Roman culture. They're learning, instead of Hebrew, they're learning Greek and Latin. They're being influenced heavily by new Western ideals and philosophies that are losing their culture, losing their identity because they have been lax in their faith. And by following the laws of Moses with strict adherence, it wasn't so much a do's and don'ts. It was the law is a gift from God. And by following the law, we show an example to our neighbors and live it in our own households. We teach our children. And by doing so, God's love for us, by giving us the law, is reflected in our obedience to God. It is not a chore, it's a joy, except when it gets so strict, so stringent, that Jesus challenges them and says things like, yeah, you just drain out a gnat to follow the precise small points of the law, but you swallow a camel. Like, you set the bar so high that you don't have any mercy or lenience for anybody else who doesn't get it quite the way that you see it in your mind's eye. So today, it might be, what kind of Christ followers read the Bible not literally, not good ones? What kind of God followers drink alcohol or allow their kids to read Harry Potter, for goodness sake? What kind of good churchgoer doesn't dress in their Sunday best? Because these are the traditions of what is proper, the rules of honoring God. In one of my early churches, I'll change the names here. Some of you might know this individual. I was leading youth, and there was a young girl, Lisa. She had an older sister who had just graduated high school. She had just turned 16. She was going to be a sophomore in high school. Her older sister was the belle of the ball. She was a valedictorian in a class of 1,200 students. She was number one. All-state athlete. Homecoming court, and I think she was the prom queen even. When her parents talked about her older sister, it was always about, she's getting ready to go full ride so-and-so, she's going into medical school, she's got it all figured out. Always great accolades. But when it came to Lisa, it always felt a little bit like an afterthought. And Lisa went from 8th and 9th grade to this sophomore year to hanging out with a different crew of friends, ones that her folks didn't really approve of, dated an older guy, a much older guy, that got her into some trouble, again with her folks, started to change how she dressed, back in the complete goth, all black, purple mascara, makeup, black lipstick, studded collars around the neck and the wrist, and a girl that was 6'3", hard to miss. Hadn't seen Lisa for a while after confirmation, and she came to church one Sunday. Again, I hadn't seen her probably in a year and a half, and the first words after I said, "Lisa, how are you? It's good to see you," wasn't what a normal teenager often says. "Good." "Okay." One word. "Yeah, good." I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, "I really need to be here today. I just needed to know that I could be somewhere where I was loved." That's what she said. And she had her all leather, short skirt, black, purple, piercings. I said, "That's great. We'll catch up after church, you and me. Let's catch up." So we had worship after church, looking for Lisa in the line, looking for her everywhere. Can't find her. Her grandfather, a well-respected person in the church, comes up to me. "Lisa's out in the parking lot. She needs you. Can you go talk to her?" So I go out there. Here's this girl. Tears streaming down her eyes, mascara all running. She said, we were starting to sing the first hymn, and the lady in front of me turned around. And she looked at me and said, "How can you come to church dressed like that? Looking like a pig. My mother would never let me out of the house looking like you look. How disrespectful can you be?" Now, on the one hand, I know exactly the cloth the lady was cut from. I mean, she grew up. Her mother, her grandmother had taught her, you wear your Sunday best. You give glory to God by how you dress, by how you come to church. You don't come sloppily. You don't come looking perhaps like, you don't come looking like we don't expect you to look. I went to the lady and tried to explain that this kid had been through trauma. This kid had been through some things that she may have never faced in her life. The important thing, she was here because she wanted to be with God and with God's people who loved her. But I couldn't sway her at all. No. Unclean. Dirty. How dare you come to God like that? There's another example. Different church. Gosh, I wish this was all the same place. Different church. I was a little kid, a little bit younger than some of these guys, maybe 3 years old, popping up, mom sitting next to him, popping up, looking at a lady behind him, older lady, making faces. Peekaboo. The older lady behind him in the pew started to make faces back. They were having a grand old time. Were they paying attention to the sermon? Probably not. Were they having a godly, beautiful moment? Absolutely. Mother jerks the kid down. Shh, quiet. We don't do that in church. What comes out of the heart Jesus says, so concerned about the rightness or relationship. You want to be right all the time, or do you want to have relationship with God and with each other? So Jesus challenges the Pharisees, and there's a text, part of the text that's not in today's lectionary reading, which is unfortunate. I didn't want to make Marty read the whole thing. I mean, that's a long. You already read a lot. Thank you. But Jesus says to these guys, listen, you take your korban, which is a Jewish gift, and they give it to God for the sanctuary, for the temple, for the upkeep of the temple. It's called korban. And he said, you give your extra money to the temple, and you say, this is all for God. And that's great in itself, but instead of using some of that money to care for your elderly parents, honoring the command to honor your father and mother, the commandment that Moses gave us, you created these man-made rules that really make yourself feel better and look better, but really actually deny the relationship and care for somebody else who depends upon you. And again in Mark's gospel, whether it's the widow's mite, and Mark pairs that with the Pharisees and scribes and the teachers of the law love to have the best seats in the house, and they love the accolades of the people in the market to notice their flowing tassels and their robes. And then Mark tells us how much they love that self-honor and to be pious before God and to be known as good, godly people. And then Mark, right next to that, puts the widow's mite. Here's this widow who, by the way, is supposed to be cared for by the temple, the priests, the prophets, the scribes. There isn't supposed to be a destitute widow, but there she is, giving her last 2 cents. And Jesus says she gave everything that she had to live on. And meanwhile, Mark, the gospel writer, says, the scribes and the Pharisees love to devour the houses of widows and orphans while they take the highest seats of honor and faith. And we say to ourselves when we hear this text, man, those guys are horrible. Geez. How could they be so tightly twisted, so uppity in their faith, so up here in their self-righteousness? And again, I would say this text is not supposed to be about them. It's a mirror to say, how about you? How about me? How about our hearts? When do we do this? Fight fire with fire, saying something unkind, doing something that makes somebody feel belittled and devalued. This is the heart of what this text is all about. A rabbi, an itinerant preacher that they've come to check up on, who is constantly pushing boundaries and borders and challenging us to what's coming out of our hearts before God. What makes a person clean or dirty? And Jesus gets Jesus is talking at first to the crowds, then he's talking to the scribes and Pharisees, then he goes in the house with the disciples, and again, just like 100 other times, the disciples are like, what are you talking about? I mean, are you talking about Twinkies and ding-dongs? What are you talking about as far as what we eat and going in? And Jesus gets very specific with this. He says, whatever goes in your mouth goes in your stomach, goes out the sewer, flush. That's not what makes you unclean. Before God, what makes you unclean is things that come out of your heart. So it's really interesting because they're talking about obedience to God, and Jesus doesn't say you're wrong. Jesus says obedience to God absolutely matters. But it's not so much about your social mores and your do's and don'ts list and your strict rule following. It's about how you're really treating your neighbor, your enemy, your family, and your God from your heart. That's why we added that Proverbs verse, a crucible tests the purity of silver, a furnace tests the purity of gold, and it says God weighs our hearts. God knows the substance of what's in here, what comes out of us. And so I think about today, as Jesus is engaged in this ongoing conversation with the scribes and Pharisees, it's important also to note that he doesn't give up on the scribes and Pharisees. He pushes them, puts the ball back in their court. They've attacked him. He says, yeah, but I want you to look in your own spiritual backyard. Before you go, pointing fingers at my disciples, how is it really in your own spiritual backyard? Where are places that God might have you have a more open heart? And I say this on the one hand thinking in myself, man, I know a lot of Christians today, of them, that are driven by fear and anger, and so a lot of things coming out of their mouths or their actions feel really ugly to me. And then I realize as I say that, I'm doing the very same thing that the Pharisees and scribes are doing to them. So how do I, in an age of social media and somebody typing something anonymously and just dropping it, how do the things that come out of me, because I can't control them, but I certainly control my actions, my words. Are they good news? Are they healing? Are they life-giving? How about you? Lord, Lisa did not come back to church after that moment until my last Sunday. I saw her again about 10 years ago after an amazing saint of that church died, came with her daughter, her newborn daughter, to the church and said she had been coming back. I said, thanks be to God. Because the woundedness of that moment, again, I understand that Pharisaic, this is how it is, this is how we should be. But on the other hand, the woman who called her a pig had no idea, couldn't see beneath the surface of the book of what this young girl was carrying, what she had been through. And if she had been able to see past the black mascara and the studs, she would have seen a daughter of the living God who was desperate to know that she was loved, and believed it was true of her church community, and in that moment was failed by it. How do we live into it? We never get there. It's a day-to-day living. So how about you? Amen.